știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce-nseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. костяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome. It is the evening of the 4th of August, 2025, and we're starting a couple of minutes early tonight. So be sure to get liking and sharing the stream if you haven't done so already. Tonight, we are going to be talking about, as the title suggests, what does a revolution look like? And we're going to be talking about, historically, the role of what were once referred to as the bourgeois specialists in the period of the Russian Revolution, and what their the usage of these individuals in trying to relaunch or refire, shall we say, the Russian economy, which was shattered by the years of war with German imperialism and then the Civil War, and what that meant long term for the Soviet Union. Now, what we're talking about here is, of course, the situation which confronted Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership in late 1917, early 1918, which was where there was a significant immediate problem which was that all forces of reaction were unifying behind the leadership of the Tsarist and fascist generals and military officers such as Denikin, Admiral Kolchak, Pyotr Wrangel, and others, who were determined to bring down the new workers' state and who are actively collaborating with the imperialist forces of intervention. So the forces of Britain, France, the United States principally, but not exclusively them. You also had Italy and Japan and a number of other states sent contingents as well. It was a very much an attempt to destroy the early Soviet Union by an international coalition led principally by Britain and France. And that's not an accident, because it was Britain and France who lost the most in terms of investments in Russia when the revolutionary leaders issued a decree nationalizing most of the major industries, and essentially bringing private economic activity to a close, industrially speaking, in 1918. And so it's no surprise that those who were the principal investors in that industry, who were looking to regain it, were the ones at the head of the international coalition. But the Bolshevik leadership was confronted with an immediate problem when the war started, which is you have two issues, well, three issues, which you need to solve urgently if you're going to win this war. Firstly, you need an industrial base that can supply the army, but also keep supplying certain things to the population. And also, going alongside that, you need to be able to feed the cities. And this, of course, means getting grain from the countryside, which means making an arrangement with the peasants. And in the period of the 1918 to 21 called War Communism, what this meant was grain requisitions from the peasantry, but also it meant that the factories had to be run in a manner that was not in accordance with the early visions of the worker Bolsheviks, meaning that by 1918, Lenin and the other Bolshevik leaders were forced to institute a system of one-man management in the factories. They were forced to employ the services of what are referred to as the bourgeois specialists, meaning factory managers, senior technical staff, engineers, people who could manage the technical side, technical and administrative side of the factories, and who were also from, if not the bourgeois class, then at least the petty bourgeoisie, and almost all of whom came in carrying with them strong elements of bourgeois ideology. Now, here I must mention what Stalin said in his work Anarchism or Socialism about the lag of consciousness, how consciousness lags behind material reality. So just because by 1918, the Bolsheviks had dispossessed the Russian bourgeoisie of its control over the means of production. So by 1918, there was no power left in the typical way for the Russian bourgeoisie. The economy the means of production had essentially been nationalized. The economic activity of the bourgeoisie had been brought to a close. But that does not mean, as Lenin stated on numerous occasions, that the bourgeois ideology had gone. It had not. Bourgeois ideology might have come late to Russia. The Russian bourgeoisie might have been a late developing and somewhat weak creation. But the prevalence of bourgeois ideology, not just amongst the bourgeoisie themselves, but amongst those who had constituted the hierarchy of the in the factories and in other fields of industry and commerce, those people were positively drenched in bourgeois ideology, even if they weren't bourgeois themselves. These are the people who the Bolsheviks had to turn to manage the factories in 1918 to get industry working again. And this, of course, creates conflicts. It creates problems because this we're talking about is the restoration of essentially bourgeois organization in the factories, but under the conditions of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Also, as they brought back in bourgeois specialists into the factories and wider industry, and also bourgeois military specialists in the army who had to work alongside ideological officers called commissars, but who gained an increasing amount of freedom of action as time went on. See, in the early period, immediately after the revolution, soldiers' committees were running everything. If you read the work of American journalist and possible American intelligence agent John Reed, you'll see what I mean. If you go and read 10 Days That Shook the World, Reed recounts, and this is backed up by other revolutionaries who wrote about this at the time. Reed recounts trying to get decisions out of military units around the time of the October Revolution. It was borderline impossible because there was all kinds of different committees, soldiers' committees, where decision making had to go through. See, the army had broken down and barely even had a unified command structure anymore. So to win the war between 1918 to 1921, which is the length of the Russian Civil War, the Bolshevik leaders had to restore a certain amount of bourgeois norms in the military as well. So they had to restore officer ranks. They had to restore the wearing of the wearing of like epaulets and braiding and something like that. So this restores a certain amount of, should we say, bourgeois privileges and ideology into the military, which again was argued as a necessity, including by a certain Leon Trotsky at the time, because you couldn't fight a war against the kind of mass interventions that the Bolsheviks were being subjected to by the imperialist powers on a dispersed militia type system. You couldn't do it. And again, it was Trotsky who forcefully argued for that point, which makes his later turnaround rather interesting. But this was successful. The attempts to regenerate Russian industry using the bourgeois specialists and having to move away from the system of workers' control that was favored by the left wing of the Bolsheviks, by the left SRs, by the anarchist elements, that worked. And Lenin made the specific argument that they had to learn from the bourgeois specialists. Now, here I will quote from, if you'll just bear with me a moment. Yes, Lenin's speech to the Third All Russia Congress of Soviets of Workers, Soldiers and Peasants Deputies in 1918. Lenin said the following, quote, "There was not a man among us who could imagine that an intricate and subtle apparatus like banking, which grew out of the capitalist system of economy in the course of centuries, could be broken or transformed in a few days. We never said that. And when scientists or pseudoscientists shook their heads and prophesied, we said, you can prophesy what you like. We know only one way for the proletarian revolution, namely to occupy the enemy's positions, to learn to rule by experience from our mistakes. We do not in the least belittle the difficulties of our path, but we have done the main thing. Source of capitalist wealth has been undermined in the place of its distribution. After all this, the repudiation of the state loans, the overthrow of the financial yoke was a very easy step. Transition to confiscation of the factories after workers' control had been introduced was also very easy. When we were accused of breaking up production into separate departments by introducing workers' control, we brushed aside this nonsense. In introducing workers' control, we knew it would take much time before it spread to the whole of Russia, but we wanted to show that we recognize only one road. Changes from below. We wanted the workers themselves from below to draw up the new basic economic principles. Much time will be required for this. So what he's talking about there, he's talking about how there was a certain amount of nationalization had gone on and workers' control was still the objective, but the workers needed to learn how to run the systems. They didn't know how to actually run things. Didn't know the complexities of how to run a factory or a supply chain, or how to replace machinery. Like, all of this was the prerogative of the bourgeois specialists. This was management's prerogative. So they had to bring those people back, whilst at the same time trying to get workers educated in drawing up economic plans. Now, this process took a long time. Arguably, it wasn't really until the process of the 5-year plans began that the workers began to actively exercise this part of workers' control that Lenin wanted to develop. It took quite some time. See, what you have being introduced, and this was solidified in the period of the new economic policy, you had not only the bourgeois specialists in the factories, but also you had a certain amount of privileges that were allowed to the bourgeois specialists in the factories, which Lenin argued, against much opposition from the left of the Bolshevik party, Lenin argued that you needed to give them a certain amount of privileges in order to get them working, that you couldn't just make them work at gunpoint. And this has been proven to be correct. So this was a necessary retreat, Lenin stated. And it was a necessary retreat because without the cooperation of the bourgeois specialists, the factories wouldn't have been able to get moving again. They wouldn't have been able to establish, and this was something that Lenin regarded as very important, a nationwide integrated system of planning and accounting, which you needed the cooperation of the bourgeois specialists in order to do. So from the earliest period, when they started to have to make concessions to secure these specialists' acquiescence to work in the new Soviet economy and state, the Lenin, Stalin, and others knew very well that what they were doing was a step backwards from where they wanted to be. But they couldn't, unlike anarchists believe that you can just jump straight to workers' control without an intervening period. Just like anarchists believe you can jump straight to a stateless society. Whereas Marx observed all the way back in as early as the 1840s, Marx was very clear that it would take 25, 50, maybe 100 years to get to the point where it was possible to actually have full and proper workers' control, because the working class needs to increase its level of culture and education to the point where taking over the running of factories under workers' control can be achievable. You can't just leap there and get there via force of will. I wish you could, but you can't. And in the situation of civil war, and in the situation of near destruction of the revolutionary state, then Lenin regarded it correctly as acceptable to make those concessions to the bourgeois specialists. Now, this becomes more of an issue when we proceed past 1921 into the period of the new economic policy. Again, something that Lenin called state capitalism under workers' control, under the situation of the proletarian dictatorship. The dictatorship of the proletariat still existed, but you had introduced into it the reemergence of capitalism, the reemergence of a capitalist class in Russia, to a degree anyway. The reemergence of speculators, or people that they were referred to as net men, the growth of the kulaks, etc. And so all of this was necessary. Why? Lenin argued, again correctly, and Stalin argued as well, that it was necessary in order to get, and again, a certain amount of capital accumulated to further revive Russian and wider Soviet industry, and also to build so that the Soviet state could spend a significant amount of time developing the strength of the party within the working class and peasantry, which was the party was in a very weak position by 1921. It was still strong in the advanced elements of the working class, but in terms of coverage amongst the what became the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks, then the CPSU Bolsheviks, Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks. But the Bolshevik strength in the countryside in 1921 was very, very lacking. Bear in mind that until and even after the Bolshevik Revolution, you got the socialist revolutionaries, the SRs, being the dominant force amongst the peasantry, and they remained the dominant force amongst the peasantry even after 1917. So even after the SR leadership had defected to the side of the whites, had fought on their side, had committed heinous crimes against many peasants, they still remained the largest organized force with a very strong foothold in the middle and the upper layer of the peasantry. So just because the Mensheviks, the social revolutionaries, the anarchists and others who had sided with the whites disappeared nominally by 1921, these were all chased into exile. Their organizations had been banned because they sided with the whites and the foreign interventionists, quite rightly so that they were banned. But didn't mean that these organizations went away. The Mensheviks and the SRs and the anarchists, to a degree, maintained a certain level of organization amongst certain elements of the working class, and certainly for the SRs amongst the peasantry, for quite some time after 1921. And so it was necessary to spend the time in between 1921 to 1929 essentially rebuilding the Bolshevik Party as part of the process of building up towards the period where rapid industrialization could be commenced. Because if you'd have tried rapid industrialization in 1921 or 1922 or 1924, it wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked partly because the Bolshevik Party didn't have the necessary strength amongst the Russian masses anymore to actually lead a politically successful fight to win over the masses for that project. You needed the Lenin intake in 1924, that mass intake into the what became the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. You needed that mass intake to expand the coverage of the party, particularly in the countryside, even with all the contradictions that brought with it. See, it brought with it a whole bunch of people who were probably not communists when they came in, and might not even have been communists by the time they'd been through the party training. It would have brought with it foreign agents, would have brought with it saboteurs. But the fact is, again, the leadership this time with Stalin as general secretary after the death of Lenin was faced with a situation where they had to expand the party's coverage. So they had to take a calculated risk on expanding the membership quite rapidly, the membership of the party quite rapidly, knowing full well that they were going to be exposed to all kinds of potential problems. So the reason for the NEP, the switch away from war communism, the reason for tolerating what Lenin himself referred to as state capitalism in the early Soviet Union up to 1929 was to, first of all, build up Soviet industry to the point where it could sustain a rapid advance towards industrialization, build up a certain amount of capital, and again, educate the working class in the necessary in the necessary cultural and technical ways that would be important for them to in their understanding of their role as the new managers of industry and wider society and state. All of that is necessary before we get to the point where mass industrialization could be done. So Trotsky calling for it in 1925 and 1926 is essentially jumping the gun repeatedly. And again, going down like an ultra left deviation. Now, as Stalin says repeatedly in his works, or his speeches and writings towards the end of the 1920s, you have to bring the masses with you if you're going to go on this this drive for mass industrialization and collectivization of the land. Now, the collectivization question is a little bit different because there you had a vicious class war in the countryside in all of the rural areas of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, what's now Belarus, and Russia. You had a nearly open warfare at times going on between the poor peasants, the landless peasants, or the small peasants, and the kulaks. It was this which actually is part of the reason that where the Soviet government was compelled to act on collectivization, because you had a state by 1929, you had a state of near civil war in many different areas of the country. And so faced with that in 1929, that I would argue prompted the Soviet government to act very rapidly towards agricultural collectivization, because if they hadn't have done so, then the war between the landless and the small peasants and the kulaks and their allies would have risked completely destroying agricultural production. As it was, when the Soviet government took the side of the landless peasants and started to collectivize the property of the kulaks did as much damage as they possibly could, killing livestock, sabotaging agricultural machinery, literally salting the earth so nothing could grow. All these are things that were done and have been documented even by bourgeois sources, but which, of course, contemporary reactionaries will always deny that this happened. But this was what was going on. But the civil war in the countryside, the class war in the countryside, is what compelled the Soviet government to take the side of the landless peasants and push for collectivization as rapidly as they did. Now, going back to the question of the bourgeois experts, which is where we started off this discussion, Lenin was always aware, and Stalin was always aware, that the giving of privileges to the bourgeois experts in not just in industry, but also in the state administration. So you have to remember that building a state administration after October 1917 was a necessary but a very tricky business. Most of the senior people from the old administration of the provisional government of Kerensky were actually holdovers from before that, from the Tsarist period. And again, like many of them were adherents to bourgeois ideology. Remember, Stalin's words again, that consciousness lags behind material reality. So even with the bourgeoisie having been severely weakened, and even though nominally there was the dictatorship of the proletariat was not in a condition to rule as of yet. So again, necessary concessions were made to the bourgeois specialists. Now, here I want to quote from Lenin in an article, it's a letter he wrote to the Central Committee of the what was then called Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks, and it's entitled "All Out for the Fight Against Denikin." So this is from the Civil War period, 1919. Quote reads as follows: "Our party program, both on the general subject of bourgeois experts and on the particular problem of one of their varieties, the military experts, has defined the policy of the Communist Party with absolute precision. Our party is waging and will continue to wage a relentless struggle against the pseudo-radical but actually ignorant and conceited opinion that the working people are capable of overcoming capitalism and the bourgeois social system without learning from bourgeois specialists, without making use of their services, and without undergoing the training of a lengthy period of work side by side with them. At the same time, of course, the party does not make the slightest political concession to this bourgeois section of the population. The party suppresses and will continue to ruthlessly suppress any counter-revolutionary attempts on its part. Naturally, whenever such an attempt is made or becomes more or less probable, its ruthless suppression requires other qualities than the deliberateness, the cautiousness of an appetite, which are demanded for lengthy training, and which the latter inculcates. The contradiction between the attitude of people engaged in a lengthy period of work side by side with the military experts and the attitude of people absorbed in the direct task of ruthlessly suppressing a counter-revolutionary attempt of military experts might easily lead, and does lead, to friction and conflict. The same applies to the necessary changes of personnel and the shifting around sometimes of large numbers of military experts, which is necessitated by instances of counter-revolutionary attempts, and all the more by large-scale conspiracies. Now, what he's talking about there is the contradictions that do emerge when you're using bourgeois specialists, especially in the military, but this can also be applied to in industry. The bourgeois specialists who you are obliged to rely on in the military had to be watched constantly by the political officers, the commissars, and then the checker, because many of them were proven to be conspiring and involved in anti-revolutionary, counter-revolutionary conspiracies with the people on the other side, which again created suspicion and fear and conflict amongst even the bourgeois specialists in the military who weren't treacherous. But again, the party is obliged to deal with this situation, given that the alternative was to not use any of them, and then have all of them either just disappear or go over to the other side, and you are left with nobody who can do the job of like organizing the army for battle. You can't just rely on voluntarism. Nobody did, by the way. I mean, this is what makes a lot of later Maoist critiques completely daft, because nobody, certainly not the Chinese Red Army during the revolutionary period, just relied upon voluntarism and never brought in like people who'd been trained as officers under the previous system. Nobody ever said that. Nobody ever just developed a military genius overnight, not without a lot of trial and error. So Lenin was very aware of the contradictions that were building up and always sought to take active measures to control these. But he was also aware that these contradictions were a necessary thing, that without the usage of the bourgeois experts, there wouldn't be much of a revolution at all, given the state of post-Civil War Russia in 1921. Now, the dangers, though, and again, Lenin understood these, Stalin understood these too, were there from the very beginning. And these dangers did later manifest themselves in the coming of revisionism. See, to get the specialists working in industry, in what we call now like the civil service, the state administration, and also in the military, you had to offer them pay incentives, so offer them 2 times, 3 times the amount that the workers were earning, but also then offer them other inducements such as access to enhanced levels of rations, be it food or consumer goods. And this, again, a necessary concession to make in the early days, but it did lead to significant problems later on. And we'll conclude on this point because I'll want to take questions, and then we'll develop this point in the next episode. What it led to, though, in terms of the bourgeois specialists, was that again, many of them, at best, came to a point of neutrality with regard to the revolution. They were prepared to work in the state administration, in management positions, or in military positions, but many of them remained with a degree of hostility and had to be bought off, essentially. And that created a problem. It created a problem because in addition to the extra pay they were receiving, as I said, many of them got extra rations of food, And a lot of this ended up on the black market, traded away, leading to a greater financial advantages for bureaucrats, for managers in industry, and for military officers. And so this again leads to an intensification of class conflict when we get to the 1930s. When we get to the 1930s and the mass industrialization of the 5-year plans, you start to see the dictatorship of the proletariat take a more start to advance and take a more concrete form. See, in the 1930s, you started to see, and we'll cover this in more depth as we proceed onwards, workers actually not only drawing up plans for production, plans for the management of their factories and industries, but also use their position as the ruling class, essentially start to use that position to get rid of managers who were regarded as reactionary, counter-revolutionary, or hostile to the working class. Now, Lenin, back in 1921, at the beginning of the NEP, made the observation that, and again, arguing against Trotsky and others who argued for state control of the trade unions, Lenin made the observation that it may be necessary, even under even in the workers' state, for workers to actually go on strike. Workers frequently did go on strike in that early period in the 1920s, and the disputes were usually settled via negotiation in the workers' favor. And so there was a degree of success that occurred between 1921 and 1929 in terms of building up the educational and cultural level of the working class, so that by the 1930s, you started to see the working class progressively more actively exercising its dictatorship. So they would actually, if the bourgeois specialist was no good or ran the factory like a tyranny, then they could be got rid of. Sometimes could be arrested, and that was one of the reasons why the class struggles in the 1930s was so utterly ferocious, and why you have all the different dramatic events going on there, because at the bottom level you have the working class not only embracing the idea of the 5-year plans and mass industrialization, but starting to exercise its dictatorship against like the managers and against the bureaucrats. This created an awful lot of resentment, fear, and anger within the bureaucracy, within the layers of the bourgeois specialists. And this is where the roots of what we come to know as Khrushchevite revisionism come from. The roots of Khrushchevite revisionism lie in the factory managers, the technicians, the senior, what you would call bureaucrats, civil servants, certain elements in the military. These are the people who get repeatedly caught involving themselves in anti-state conspiracies in the 1930s, which were real, like the Tukhachevsky plot, the military plot, was a real thing. I know that the Trotskyites insist that the whole thing was made up, but there were undergrounds in the Soviet Union. There were constant plots by the imperialists. There were internal traitors everywhere. And of course, the imperialists plotted to turn the internal traitors and the discontented bureaucrats to their service. Now, Stalin was absolutely aware of these problems and was seeking to deal with them. But of course, then the matter of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union got in the way. And so, as I've said before, the dictatorship of the proletariat, though it produced the heroic fighting spirit of the Soviet peoples against the Nazis and helped to win that war, it also saw by necessity the administration of the state become more centralized and more bureaucratized, so that by the time the Soviet Union has won the war and you get into the period afterwards, you start to see where revisionism comes from. And now Trotskyites say, oh, well, Stalin did it all himself. Stalin sold out the Greek Revolution. Stalin agreed to all kinds of compromises with the imperialists, etc., etc. And then you get the perennial favorite of the Trotskyites, that Stalin created Israel. Usual gibberish. But there is a point here to be made, which is that Soviet post-war policy, both internal policy and external policy, wasn't just simply the creation of Stalin. Stalin wasn't just making this up as he went along, with no influence being had over the policy by anybody else. No, the policy of the CPSU in the middle to later 1940s was the product of the collective will of the CPSU. Now, the problem facing the Soviet leadership, including the revolutionaries such as Stalin, Andrei Zhdanov, Molotov, Malenkov to an extent, Beria, I'm still not sure about that guy, to be honest. I haven't managed to find enough data to reach a firm judgment. But again, for the revolutionaries in the leadership of the CPSU were in the minority by the period of the late 1940s. Stalin became an ever more isolated minority as time went on. Why? Because a lot of the best revolutionaries had died in the war. They hadn't been replaced. Power in the war, again, you can argue it was by necessity, transferred more and more into the bureaucracy. And it is in the upper layers of the bureaucracy that the revisionist trend is the most powerful. That is where the roots of Khrushchevite revisionism come from. See, the problems were always there from the earliest period when it was necessary to establish these privileged layers. But the difference is that whereas Lenin and Stalin knew very well that this was a risk, knew very well that they had to engage in this calculated risk in return for building up the power of the proletariat so it could effectively exercise its dictatorship, and that this was a process which was going to produce an awful lot of contradictions that needed to be handled properly. What happened was, by the time that Stalin dies, though, the great bulk of the leadership of the CPSU had already turned revisionist, because they were rooted not in the working class, but were rooted within the bureaucracy of the state, the bureaucracy of the party, the senior levels of the military, and, of course, the industrial management system. There's where revisionism has its roots. And again, this is where one has to do a proper dialectical materialist analysis. It's not just the act of having bourgeois specialists. It's not just having wage differentials that makes that guarees a slide towards revisionism and capitalist restoration. It's not having markets, and it's not even the presence of a bourgeoisie. It's what the problem comes when you get a leadership which starts to specifically deny that those contradictions exist. So if you look at Mao in The Correct Handling of Contradictions Amongst the People, you see there, and in Stalin's writings as well, and of course it's still there in Lenin, that these were leaders who absolutely understood the risks that was being taken, and that it would require an intensification of the class struggle to deal with those risks, an elevation in the cultural and political level of the proletariat in order to deal with that problem when it emerged. The problem then becomes an issue, becomes a real serious counter-revolutionary turn when you get a leader like Khrushchev rooted in the bureaucracy, rooted in the privileged layers of the bureaucracy, who then specifically denies that there are class contradictions, who then specifically denies that the class struggle will need to intensify at certain points if the dictatorship of the proletariat is to be sustained. and who then declares that there's no need for the dictatorship of the proletariat anymore. And that is the biggest problem, the fundamental problem with revisionism, which is it betrays its material origins and the material origins in a bourgeois and pro-bourgeois layer in the party, the economy, and the state, which comes to power and seeks to preserve its privileges by depoliticizing the working class and doing away with the dictatorship of the proletariat. And we'll leave the comments there for today and take questions. Right. Hello to the following people. Hello to Edward. Hello to Victor. Jace Hart. Good afternoon to you in Wisconsin. Jasmine Wolf. Robert Zvoranich. Sid Hatfield. Comrade Daniel from Somerset. Davey. Good evening to you, comrade. Hello to YepX, Nikki Const, Sherban from Bucharest, Romania, Working Prole Incorporated, Al, Jerry, Vera, Lucas, DJ Darkside, Chandler from Oregon, Slumbering Colossus, Potted Rodent, Caustic Grip, Richard V, who joins us from the Meyer Lansky Memorial Park in Las Vegas, the beating heart of the empire. Is that a real place? Wouldn't surprise me if it was. Comrade Jawad, Heidi, Sophia, T.G. Wilson, Peter Rudge, and A.D. Kravitz, Marius, Paul Verdi, Adingo Ain't Me Baby, and Irish Partisan, and Wicked Witch of the Southeast. And Marius says direct worker control without a vanguard has been a disaster wherever it's been tried, in Russia in 1917 to 18 or in 1936 1937 in Spain. Well, the influence of the CNT I've come to in Spain, I've come to believe, was disastrous in the Civil War, because though they had many people in them, many workers in them who played very heroic roles, who fought very bravely in the war, their level of disintegration and disorganization that organization promoted was ultimately a disaster. And what was actually needed was a level of centralization including in the army, that was never properly carried through. And it was never properly carried through, partially because of the objections of the CNT, partially because of the bourgeois elements within the Spanish government. Of course, the Trotskyites blame Stalin, but that's their go-to move. Going through the questions. Paul asks, I wonder what lessons the vanguard party of the working class could draw upon in a country like India today. Very interesting question. I mean, the question of capitalism in India today is a very interesting one, given that it is very much, it strikes me that India is still very much a case of of combined and uneven development, seeing as India has some very advanced capitalist elements to it, and some area and a lot of elements of not only backwardness but dire mass poverty, complete underdevelopment, inability of the central government to actually address any of these questions as well, and also the attempt by the Indian bourgeoisie to ride two horses at the same time, in the form of being a foundational member of BRICS, but also remaining close to US imperialism. I think we're reaching crunch time on a lot of these questions for the Indian bourgeoisie, given that they are determined to sell themselves as a replacement China for the US, I wonder how that's going to shake out with them also being BRICS members. Also goes to show that BRICS isn't a finished project, a finished product, and has a lot of contradictions in it. I mean, I think we should return to the question of India on another day because there's a lot of interesting things to discuss there. Sid says a large sect of the nobility fled to the area in Manchuria and held out there until a large group of them came to the US and Canada under Herbert Hoover's administration in 31 and 32. Yeah, there was a white enclave in Manchuria until like a series of border wars between the Soviet Union and the white armies there, or the white holdouts there, in the early 30s. Because, of course, China had territorially disintegrated in the 1920s, and there were various warlords ruling various different areas there. And so the remnants of the whites actually held out there for quite some time. Hello to NNNNMM. Careful how you pronounce that one. Hello to you out there in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Douge says, could Alex elaborate on who, what exactly is the working class in contemporary terms? The description seems anachronistic to me. Well, that's an interesting one. I will put that to one side and put it into the Q&A that will be held later this week. Would Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar, be worth reading? A friend recommended it to me. So ask Sophia. So that's by Simon Sebag Montefiore. I think it's worth reading. He's a reactionary who wants to demonize Stalin, but he ends up actually painting a picture of Stalin that's quite sympathetic in many respects. So it's an interesting book. Often these reactionaries, when they start off trying to demonize Stalin, end up like making him look more sympathetic by accident. Though I noticed that there are now more reactionaries, self-described reactionaries, who are now taking their cue, I think, from the Russian government, starting to question the mythology of the anti-Stalin paradigm, as Grover Furr refers to it. That's an interesting development. Caustic Grit referring to the Trotskyists, so then Stalin sold out the Spanish communists, which of course the Soviet leaders I always say the Soviet leadership, because Stalin was, yes, preeminent amongst them, but it was his job as general secretary to express the general will of the party, which is what he did faithfully throughout his time as general secretary. So yeah, the general line on Spain was that they would assist, but the fact is the Soviet Union couldn't go in and fight and win the war for the Spanish. The Spanish Revolution, I mean, we should probably do a whole fucking series on this. It wasn't a doomed struggle by any means. It wasn't something which it was impossible to win. There were problems. I mean, one of the biggest problems was that a lot of those who were nominally on the side of the Republic were dubious. Like there were Spanish bourgeois forces who were nominally on the side of the Republic, who were very weak and perpetually vacillating, who were terrified of the Spanish working class and peasantry, and who were unwilling to do what it took to win the war. So there's that. There's also the fact that the Spanish Communist Party was very small. It was overshadowed by the reformists of the PSOE, led by Largo Caballero, and the CNT, the anarchists. That doesn't make for a very good or stable combination. So the political forces in play there were unstable, were not under the command of the Comintern by any means. The Spanish the Spanish communists did manage to get the army professionalized to a degree and institute some level of like political education in the army, but it was kind of too late by that stage. Plus, the fascist side had active assistance from Germany and Italy in the form of troops on the ground and air force support, and also I believe it was 20,000 troops at least from fascist Portugal crossed the border to participate in the war as well. That and the fact that Britain and France, despite not intervening directly, did everything they could to secure a Franco victory. So to say that the Soviet Union should have done more, well, there's Trotsky's sort of fevered fantasies about what could have been done, but given that some of his followers were caught collaborating with fascists in Spain anyway, and his ability to deliver lectures should be treated with extreme skepticism. Just rolling back. Do you have any connection with KPML in Norway? I don't personally. I'm not aware of their stuff, to be honest, comrade. But I will look them up now. You've made a suggestion. You also ask, listen to academic agent going through the Trotsky speech about. You mean the Khrushchev speech about Stalin 1956, among other stuff? Very interesting. Stalin was probably not a lovely guy, but from that to demonizing totally. I mean, what's this? I mean, this was Khrushchev stuff about how rude Stalin was, which actually what that effectively means is that Stalin insisted on holding people accountable for their errors. I mean, half that stuff in the Khrushchev speech, or an awful lot of it, is very telling, like what it's all about. It's first of all a great amount of it is wild exaggerations and lies, but a lot of it is like Stalin was mean to this person at this date, you know. So a lot of it relates to like the bitching of the pro bourgeois layer, like officials in the party, bureaucrats in the state, factory managers, etc., who wanted to bury Stalin because Stalin represented the revolutionary tradition in the Bolshevik party, which they wanted to bury along with him. And that's the essence of revisionism now. So the essence of a lot of the complaints made by Khrushchev about Stalin being mean to this person or that person. Caustic Grip says Khrushchev, or Pig as they called him at the time, was to a large extent a Trump-esque figure. He not only denied the existence of internal contradictions, but blindly asserted complete fiction. That's very true. Working Parole Incorporated asked about Israel. Well, we'll stick that in the Q&A, which we'll hold tomorrow. I'll schedule it in a minute. Hello to Jenny, by the way. Albert wants a series on the Spanish Civil War. Caustic Grip says, my point was that Stalin did not sell out Spain, but the situation with logistics was almost impossible, along with many internal Spanish political problems. Yes, that's correct. Discussion of Putin's idea of Lenin as a nation destroyer. I mean, that's just pure fiction. I mean, for all that, like, we support the Russian Federation's fight against NATO, Putin's characterization of Lenin as a nation destroyer is utter fucking gibberish, to be blunt. Lenin, without Lenin, there would have been no Bolshevik revolution. We're talking about the intersecting of the individual and the path of historical development. And Stalin, to contrast Lenin and Stalin, here the KPRF are correct. To say that one is the builder of nations and the other one was the destroyer of them is total fucking garbage, to be honest. And it's the Russian bourgeois leadership trying to square a circle, basically. They want to claim, they have to claim the Soviet legacy to a degree, because the entire reason why they can survive against the US imperial and British imperial aggression now is because of the Soviet legacy. But at the same time, their existence as a Bonapartist bourgeois regime is dependent upon a counter-revolution that was specifically there to destroy what was left of the revolutionary traditions and to restore Tsarism and obscurantism and all the other garbage that was chased out by the October Revolution. Also, they have been forced to claim the legacy of Stalin, which is mass industrialization and the making of the Soviet Union into the second most powerful country in the world. But they want to do that without going near Lenin, because Lenin, of course, represents the revolution that got rid of the Tsardom, which they still like to laud. The Russian bourgeois still likes to laud that collection of pathetic inbred losers. And they're trying to square this circle by saying, oh, Lenin's bad, but Stalin's good, which makes no sense, because the foundations of the success, which they rightly defend now you have like Putin and Lavrov and Zakharova, who all denounced Stalin 15 years ago, 10 years ago. They were still denouncing Stalin. Now they have finally started having to defend accurately, as it turns out, to the Soviet industrial and military legacy that won them the Great Patriotic War, while still continuing to denounce the revolutionary legacy that made it all possible, or trying to go along with this like bourgeois Western idea that Stalin represented a restoration of Tsardom. I mean, if anything, Khrushchev was closer to that. I mean, it's complete gibberish. But this is what they're obliged to do. This is what the Russian leadership is now obliged to do. It has to lean on the Soviet legacy. They've been obliged to allow the regrowth of popularity of Stalin. They couldn't restrain it anymore. They're now obliged to go further and further towards restoring the reputation of Stalin, whilst at the same time desperately trying to cling to the idea of continuity with the Tsardom. What this will end up with, of course, is and as Marius says, Russian nationalists are like reverse Trotskyists. Yes. Whereas the Trotskyites will say that they are the true descendants of Lenin and Stalin is a demon, Russian nationalists are now in a position where they're saying that they are the true descendants of Stalin and Lenin was a demon. And it makes about as much sense as Trotskyism. And it can't last. It can't possibly last, because the 5-year plans, the agricultural collectivization, as we've been saying in this, all had to go through a period where, all had to stem from the period where Lenin, in his time as chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, had to make those concessions to the bourgeois specialists, and then they had to put in place the new economic policy that would lay the foundations for the leap into mass industrialization. So this makes no sense. It makes no sense when you try and divide Lenin from Stalin when the Trots did it, and it makes no sense now the Russian nationalists do it. It is amusing, though, that the anti-communists of 15 to 20 years ago are now having to restore Stalin's name to the airport of the city that once bore his name, that you are going to see Volgograd returned to being Stalingrad again. So the KPRF, I would say, just to conclude on this point, as Marius correctly points out, they have, due to the rabid hostility of imperialism, the KPRF have actually successfully shoved the Russian bourgeoisie far further than they would ever have liked to have gone. And the comprador element that wanted to see a return to Yeltsinism, whilst they are still there and should not be underestimated, they have been politically marginalized. And you've now got a situation where Russia, Putin's Russia, is actively aiding the revolutionary governments of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso in their bid to remove the lingering foul influence of French neocolonialism. See, and again, we're going to be talking about this more on the Decline and Fall show. You see what's going on in Burkina Faso right now, and the desperate attempts by the French imperialists to do what? To undermine that by doing what? Arming and funding Al-Qaeda type gangs, which, by the way, they always were, but now they're openly coming out and saying that that they're doing it on the grounds that this Traore fellow is a terrible dictator. But the Russians are playing an objectively progressive role by aiding all these countries in the fight against not only these reactionary terror gangs, but the forces for whom these gangs are working for. Now, remember, even in Nigeria, which is run by a complete comprador, the Al-Qaeda operations there, Boko Haram, even former Nigerian ministers who are by no means communists have come out and said these operations are supplied by anonymous helicopters flying in, unmarked helicopters flying in, piloted by white people to supply Boko Haram with weapons and money. Who might be doing that, do we think? But again, the Russians are playing Putin's bourgeois Russia, Putin's Bonapartist regime. Again, working off the constitution imposed by Yeltsin, is now in a situation where they are obliged to aid and take on the influence of French neocolonialism in the Sahel. Would have been unthinkable 20 years ago, but that's what's happened. They have now had to take on some of the role that the Soviet Union was playing in the African nations who are seeking liberation. So there you go. You cannot escape the blade of history in the way that it swings. So Albert says the fascists were never won without the Moroccans. That's true, and that remains a great tragedy. It remains a great tragedy because the Spanish Republic did have the opportunity to throw a spanner in the works there. They knew very well that the Moroccan troops were actually some of the most best trained and reliable forces that the Spanish military had available to it. Could have derailed their usage of those troops had the Second Republic engaged in decolonization. That would have actually created a serious problem for the fascists, because if you'd have said, they'd have said, we will now engage in a process of withdrawing from Spanish Morocco and putting it on a path to independence, then you would have cut the knees off the fascists. And some would argue, but they would have rebelled earlier. Yes, but they would have rebelled possibly without the best troops in their army, who may well have defected back to their homeland. See, by compromising on trying to maintain Spanish colonialism, such as it was, the remains of it, the Spanish Second Republic government ended up undermining itself. Chris H says Bola Tinubu is a drug dealer. Yes, he was. He was done for money laundering for drug dealers in the US when he was over there. So again, like even when he's in power, the Boko Haram remain financed by various forces in the West, worthy of further investigation, I think. All right, so I'm going to bring this to a close for tonight. We will return tomorrow with the Q&A. I'm going to put that up later tonight. So bring your questions to that one. We will start the Q&A at 6 p.m. Perfidious Albion time tomorrow. So be sure to tune in for that. But until then, thanks for watching. And here's your outro.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой. октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы.
Продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
С неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И он продолжает